Um, Thank you again for joining us for the Offshore Renewable Energy in the U.S. Learning as We Go. Again, this is part of the 17th Annual Ronald C. Baird Sea Grant Science Symposium. And I am Jennifer McCann. I'm the Director for the U.S. Coastal Programs at the University of Rhode Island Coastal Resources Center at the Graduate School of Oceanography, and also the Director of Extension for the Rhode Island Sea Grant College Program. Many of you know that Rhode Island, the United States and Rhode Island, but the United States is positioning itself to rapidly become a world producer of electricity from offshore wind, and establishing an opportunity to create clean energy and economic growth. In fact, in the next 10 years, we may see more than 2,000 wind turbines off the Atlantic coastline. As we experience this growth, however, we see that the state and local decision makers, resource users, and other end users are struggling to keep up with the decisions they're having to make, and also understand the potential impacts that may have on existing activities and natural wildlife. And while some places, including Rhode Island and Massachusetts, and of course Europe, we've been working in this game for many years. There are others who are just beginning to ask questions and get their bearings on this growth. So the purpose of this webinar series is to really share knowledge and information so that we can learn from each other. And given this growth is likely, it's allowing us to better understand how can we minimize the effects on existing future uses in wildlife, and possibly maybe find new opportunities and innovations. And how can we learn as we go? We have several co-sponsors for this series. We have obviously Rhode Island Sea Grant, University of Rhode Island Graduate School of Oceanography, Coastal Resources Center, and we're very grateful to partner with the International Council for the Exploration of the Seas, the Working Group on Marine, Benthic, and Renewable Energy Developments, and then of course Venture Cafe and District Hall in Providence, which we're very excited about. So today we're going to hear about the change in biological diversity and ecological interactions resulting from new offshore renewable energy structures at a local scale, and also looking at a larger ecosystem scale. We have two amazing researchers who will introduce themselves in a minute. And then we also have three amazing individuals, one representing a federal entity, a state government, and also a resource user. So we're getting from a regulatory management and resource user perspective to make sure that the science is relevant to many of the questions that we have here in the U.S. So before we start everything, what we're going to do is I would like each one of you guys to just quickly introduce yourselves. Then we're going to have Jan and Emma are going to give a quick 15-minute presentation each. We're going to have discussion amongst the panel, and then we will open it up to questions. As Avi mentioned, if you guys could write your questions in the chat, Andy and I are going to be looking at the chat to answer any questions or to pick questions up and to integrate them into the discussion. This is recorded, so you can share this with your friends afterwards. And so with that, Jan, why don't we start with you? Could you introduce yourself?
Morning for most of you, I think, or good afternoon for the ones that are joining this from Europe, from our part of the ocean. My name is Jan van Averbeeke, and I'm working at the Royal Belgian Institute of Natural Sciences. This is an institute in Brussels, and I'm actually part of a group that is really investigating the effects of offshore wind farms on the marine ecosystem. So offshore wind farms is our central topic, and we look at it, how this is interacting with birds, sea mammals, fish, noise, and in my case, I'm actually a benthic biologist, and I'm very interested in food web effects and also in ecosystem functioning. So my central topic is how do offshore wind farms affect carbon and nitrogen fluxes in the marine environment close to home.
Emma?
Thanks, Jen, and thanks everyone for joining us today. My name's Emma Sheehan. I'm a Senior Research Fellow from the University of Plymouth, and there I lead a team who are interested in marine protected areas, ecosystem-based management, and also offshore installations like marine renewables that have the chance to potentially be maybe super MPAs if they can exclude certain destructive activities and build structure and habitat. So I'll give a more full in-depth introduction in my talk.
Great. Dave? Bethany?
Great, thank you very much for the opportunity to be a part of this group. I'm the Executive Director of the Commercial Fisheries Research Foundation, and we're really, it's a group, a board of directors of really forward-thinking fishermen and fishery industry people that support research and education to develop sustainable fisheries. So I'm in that thread right now, but in a previous life, I was a benthic ecologist, and I really focused on taking images of the seafloor and studying the animals in there, specifically scallops, and how they interact with the environment. So I think it gives me a good kind of segue to both groups that are presenting here and the groups I represent now.
Great, thank you. Julia?
Hello everybody, I'm Julia Livermore. I'm a supervising biologist with the Rhode Island DEM Division of Marine Fisheries. I serve as our division's point person on all things offshore wind and oversee our reviews on federal offshore wind components and any components in state waters as well. Our division's goal has been to support offshore wind development in an effort to mitigate the effects of climate change, but also trying to minimize any biological and impacts to our fisheries or other stakeholders, but also ensuring that the best available data are being used in our decision making.
Great. Thank you, Julia. And then Andy's co-moderating this with me, so he's going to introduce himself and tell us why this is so important to us.
Thank you, Jen. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Awesome. Good morning, everyone. Andy Lipsky. I serve as the Fisheries and Offshore Wind Science Lead for NOAA Fisheries at the Northeast Fisheries Science Center. And really excited to have this exchange of dialogue and information between our ICES partners and colleagues, Jan and Emma, and us here in the U.S. As Jen had mentioned, we in the U.S. are getting ready for fairly large scale and at a fast pace offshore wind development that looks to be setting thousands of turbines in the water, at least in the U.S. Atlantic, and thousands of miles of submarine cables. And we are really interested in learning what we've found in European cases where offshore wind has a 20-year history, and we have a 5-year history with 5 turbines in the water for the Block Island Wind Farm. The construction of offshore wind, the planning of offshore wind, the site assessment activities of offshore wind, the operation of turbines, and the decommissioning of turbines for every project is a 30-year life cycle, or 25 or 30-year life cycle. So as we develop vast areas of our outer continental shelf and change the systems in terms of the habitats changing, in terms of different processes and the structure of these communities changing through soundscape impacts, through the various noise activities during construction or the noise activities during the operation, to creating new habitats where different habitats existed beforehand, and potentially displacing important commercial and recreational fisheries and changing these areas. It's vital that we understand how these offshore wind developments interact with these uses and with our existing ecosystem. We have prominent world-class fisheries in this area, and majestic world-class wildlife and fisheries in these areas. And so sharing lessons learned from our European colleagues is vitally important. So really looking forward to the discussion today.
Great, thank you, Anne.
So let's go right to Jan. Jan, you're going to share your screen.
good afternoon and good morning again. So what I'm going to present here is actually not only my research, but as I said, we are working in a team with several people working on these effects of offshore wind farms. What I'm going to present here is a kind of interaction or integration, I should say, of the research of a couple of PhD students and their supervisors from the museum where I'm working, the Royal Belgian Institute of Natural Sciences, but also from Ghent University and NIOS in the Netherlands. And it's also from several projects which are actually ongoing at the moment. So the idea is to give you the most up-to-date developments of what we are doing and how we are actually thinking about this kind of research. So this is the background setting, a very basic marine ecosystem where there's some marine ecology going on. And you can look at the marine ecosystem as an area, as a system where there's a constant cycling between organic and inorganic matter. So some of you are maybe not hardcore biologists, so a very basic introduction. I hope you can see my arrow here. So these nutrients here, this is actually this inorganic matter. And together with sunlight, a process will start which is called photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is actually primary production. It yields organic matter in the form of small planktonic algae. So this is the phytoplankton. On the land side, we also have photosynthesis, and this gives us the plants and the trees and so on. And this is a very important process because this is really the basis of the food chain. This is a phytoplankton will be consumed by very small planktonic animals, organisms, which is then the zooplankton, and this is the basis of the food chain as well. Another part of the basis of the food chain. This is going to be consumed by things we do know and which we can see. So this is the fish we can harvest. This can be the larger crustaceans such as lobsters or crabs that actually can be harvested from the system. Not all of this plankton is going into the food chain. Some of it will just remain in the water, and at a certain moment it will die and it will sink to the sediment. We call this organic matter deposition. And one of the important functions of a sediment is actually recycling this organic matter. And if this organic matter is recycled, it means actually it's broken down to its building blocks, which are these nutrients, and these nutrients go back to the water column. So on the one hand, it's very important, this process in the sediment, because it yields like the fuel of the next phytoplankton bloom, which is at the basis of our food web and our harvestable biomass. Some of this, to be complete, some of these nutrients are not going back to the water column, but will be given back as a gas, and then they will escape to the atmosphere, and some of it will be buried. And this is also highly interesting in a climate change combating scenario, because if it's buried, it goes into the geological timescale, and it's not contributing to global change as we are facing it now. So this is a system without offshore wind farms. But if you put in there offshore wind farms, things are changing. You're losing this sandy sediments. So we get not only a loss of sandy sediments and the animals that can be living in there or associated with these sediments, you also get rid, or you're losing these recycling processes that are very important. On the other hand, we get an increase in hard substrates. We get the turbines, which are these vertical structures extending from the seafloor to the sea surface. And at least what we have in Belgium and in Europe, a lot of these turbines have associated scour protection layers, which is again an increase in a hard substrate. And with this hard substrate, there will be hard substrate associated processes that come in place of the ones that were happening in these sandy sediments. And this is happening within a wind farm, but this is a picture from what is going on in Europe. Every little color you see is a wind farm that is active or planned. And you see in the entire North Sea and the neighboring Baltic Sea, we will have a lot of these wind farms, or we are already having a lot of these wind farms. And this is starting to grow outside Europe as well. Andy mentioned, I think, 2,000 turbines in the US Atlantic side. We also have these developments in Asia, in Brazil, and so on. So this is going to happen everywhere, and there's probably going to be interaction between all these sites. The first thing that is happening when we're introducing offshore wind farms, so artificial hard substrates, is that they are colonized by what we call falling fauna. It's the animals, the fauna that is living on these places. And this is happening everywhere. Whatever report we are looking at, whatever report that is produced in any place around the world, most of these things are colonized by this falling fauna. And we get huge numbers of this. So this means that we have them in high densities. At a certain stage, we also have a very high biodiversity. That means we have lots of species. And this increased biomass will also attract other animals. Fish will be attracted because they might be feeding there, or they might find food there. And what we see is also attraction of large crustaceans, so that's our lobsters and edible crab, for instance. But these are the observations. We see these changes. But the question we really ask is, so what? What does it mean if we have this high density and high biodiversity of animals concentrated on the turbines of an offshore wind farm? Our idea here is that if you want to start answering this question about what does it mean for the environment, it means we need really targeted hypothesis driven research, which is somehow a bit different from regular monitoring. So with the ICES working group on marine benthic renewable energy developments, we just published this paper. It's I think it's 2 or 3 weeks ago. It is officially out now, in which we are really trying to link some of the effects associated with offshore wind farms here to the left are changing the abiotic environment. This means currents, vibration, noise, electromagnetic fields, and so on and so on. And these abiotic effects then will have an effect on the biology. And in this case, on this component of the biology that would deliver food for society. What did we do? So we really try to map this cause-effect relationships. Every arrow is a cause-effect relationship. Every number is a hypothesis that goes with this, and then this gives us a framework in which we can investigate the effect of these offshore wind farms on the marine environment. As an example for food research, we actually have this observation for European wind farms, or at least Belgian wind farms in this case, is that certain fish species, this was cod and poting, were attracted to turbines. So if you go fishing there, we catch them rather easily. But the really important research question here is there really local production? Because this would be beneficial for the fish species or populations, or are they just attracted to that area and come there to feed and further do nothing? So this colleague of ours really developed a research strategy into high details and a research methodologies. So we are catching cod and then adding a tag into that cod, released the fish again, and we had receivers all over the place. So if that fish would pass a receiver close by a turbine, we would actually know that this fish was staying at that turbine. And there's a lot of research was happening along those lines, and I'm just providing the summary here in these two simple diagrams. That what he showed, our colleague, was that there was really production of this fish species with a commercial interest. So that the left diagram shows that cod arrives at, well, he called it WAR, which was the wind farm artificial reef, as when they were about 1 year old, and then they stayed at the wind farm for a certain period of time in which they were actually growing. And they were growing until they would leave the wind farm and go to the area where they would spawn. So these fish will arrive, grow, leave to spawn, and then other small ones would arrive at the wind farm. Reporting, we have the same pointing, the very small ones, the very young ones, the juveniles actually live in the estuary. Then they come to the marine environment, where they again where they go to the wind farms. Again, they would grow until they would leave the wind farm for spawning again. And the ones that were in the estuary during the first year are then moving to the wind farms. So this is very nice research done along really a scientific hypothesis that gives you hard evidence that there is production, at least for these two species, during certain moments of their life. Then the next thing is how can we actually explain this? So we know that there is production, but what aspect of such offshore wind farm is contributing to this local production? And we tackled this using stable isotope research the last couple of years. So what did we do? We sampled the fauna along the entire depth gradient from the intertidal to the base of the turbine. We also sampled the scour protection layer and the soft sediment next to the scour protection layer, and we looked at the stable isotopes in those fauna. So this is, we actually looked at 13C and 15N, and then did some appropriate statistics. I'm not going to bother you with the technical details, and I'm also not going to bother you with all the nitty-gritty information that is in these three graphs. But what you actually see here is that scour protection layer is circled here because this shows quite an increased trophic diversity in that offshore wind area. If we look at this is something which is called an isotopic niche. This is of course highest in the natural environment, which was the soft substrate. But then from the entire habitats that we sampled on the turbine and scour protection layer, we find the highest value for the scour protection layer. And if you look at trophic diversity, again, there the scour protection layer is the area with the highest trophic diversity. So what it actually means for the system is that this scour protection layer, it gives additional complexity, and this additional complexity is translated into shelter for these fish species and other species as well. But it also this investigation also showed that the diversity in food items for the higher trophic levels was the highest. So it's not just shelter, it's also provisioning of different food items that helps these offshore wind farms to add to the production of, in this case, our cod and our boating. And there's also an effect on the sediment. And some of the sediment is actually lost because we put a turbine on there and we put the scour protection layer on top of it. But there's also the sediment that is next, very close, and even further away from the turbine that can be affected. And what I see, what you show here with the bullets are the cause-effect relationship. So we actually know that fauna are filter feeders, so they really take a lot of organic material from the water column. And then they produce fecal pellets, and the fecal pellets are given back to the water column and they will sink. So they will sink to the sediment. And this is the idea, is that this deposition of fecal pellets will change the sedimentary environment in the vicinity of turbines. And if you want to work along these cause-effect relationships, there's certain things you need to measure. So how much water is actually filtered? How much of this phytoplankton is actually consumed? How much of these fecal pellets do they produce? And then we have to find these changes. We have to trace them in the sediment. So how is the sediment changing? When is it changing? And what is the spatial extent of this change? And once again, I'm not going to bother you with the technical details, but what we did was experiments with 3 of our pet species. These are the species that are present in high abundances on our turbines. So this is the blue mussel, Mytilus edulus. Then this very small amphipod, Yassa hermani. It's very small, but the lowest densities we ever get is 15,000 of these amphipods per square meter. And this is really the lowest values. And then we have at the basis of the turbine, we get this anemone, Metridium dianthus. And we bring these things into the lab and we do clearance rate experiments. And from this, we actually can see how much water they actually have been filtering. And you can see that this mussels, this amphipods, and this Metridium all together on one gravity-based foundation would filter more than 5.5 million liters of seawater per day. And if this is something that is difficult to imagine, this is actually 2.2 Olympic swimming pools that are filtered per day by the fauna on one turbine. And it's obvious here the key player is the blue mussel. How much of this primary production is consumed? We tackled this through a post-chase experiment. So what you do is you label the food and you try to give the food to these communities, in this case the foliar fauna. And then the most important number is here, about 1.3% of this primary production within an offshore wind farm area is consumed by this foliar fauna. And the key player here was this very small amphipod. This paper is still submitted. I think actually yesterday we submitted the rebuttal to the reviewers. So we hope to have it out soon for the entire audience. And then we know how much is filtered, we know how much is consumed. Then we still have to know how much organic matter can be deposited at the seafloor. We measured it ourselves for Rhassa and Metridium. For Mytilus, we have to get it from the literature because we didn't do it ourselves, or not in an appropriate way at the moment. So this value is very high. It's maybe a bit too high, but still is going to be a large amount of organic material that will be deposited as fecal pellets to the sediment. And is this actually the case? Can we see that? I hope to convince you with these pictures that the sediment is actually changing. The picture to the left shows you a spy picture, so it's a technique to take pictures inside the sediment. And you see the picture to the left shows you our original sandbank sediment, which is very clean, coarse sand with a pale brown color. The pictures to the right are cores that were collected by divers, very close, starting at 1 meter from the skull protection layer to 25 meters away from the skull protection layer. And I hope you can see that these sediments look completely different. They look black. And then if we go into detail, and we see that they're much finer, there's much more organic material in there. So these sediments are actually changing. And what the original sediment, this nice pale brownish color, shows you very fast oxic processes. If you think about these recycling processes that are ongoing in a sediment, this black sediment tells you that the sediment actually becomes anoxic, so there's no oxygen anymore, and then other pathways are being used. This is close by. What about far away? Well, this is far away. This is a sample we took at the upper picture. It was we took a sample at 150 meters away from this monopile, and there you can also see the development of these black spots in the sediment. And I think last year, November, we were 100 meters away from this jacket foundations, and here again from our spy pictures, you can see the development of these black spots into the sediment. So the sediment is changing, and these black spots actually show you that the pathways from which these mineralization processes are actually ongoing are changing as well. So my take-home message here at the moment is that these offshore wind farms actually do change the habitat and the environment. And if you would do hypothesis-driven research, this will inform you about the consequences of these changes. I mean, just not just looking at the change, but also trying to understand what this change what this change will mean for the larger marine ecosystem. And why do we want to do this? Because we actually want to apply this knowledge. We can use this for marine spatial planning purposes, for instance. We can see, first thing is, where can we put our offshore wind farms? What is the best place from an ecosystem perspective. The other thing, of course, is can we combine that marine space, that space that is occupied by offshore wind farms? Can we combine it, for instance, with aquaculture? And then we have to know what we have to know. We have to get information about carrying capacity of the system. This is exactly what we are trying to investigate. And then, last but not least, you can also use that knowledge for a better design of these offshore wind farms. Why not designing offshore wind farms in such a way that they would contribute to nature restoration or to nature conservation? One example is we're really thinking about in our country is to play around with the complexity of the scour protection layer and see whether we can use this scour protection layer as a nature restoration tool.
Excellent presentation, and thank you for sharing this years of research that you guys are getting really critical information out on now. It's really helpful to us. And so what we heard from you is that by putting these structures in the water and creating, intertidal habitat down into the benthic, we are seeing the epifaunal communities, the biology that forms that fouls the structures themselves, and those changes are impacting or are having effects on changing those habitats, and with the most profound effects happening very, very close distances to the individual turbines, and enriching the benthos very close to the turbines with less influence further away. What is the state of our knowledge or the science, the research that you're doing, looking from just into what's happening at a gradient from a turbine to looking at what's happening from the wind farm level or even the seascape level, particularly in the existing habitats and fisheries that may exist there before the structure goes in?
Okay, so if I understand your question correctly, I've been focusing on very local things, and you are asking if you have information or state of the art on effects on the more regional scale.
Yes, please.
In one of the projects that are actually presented here, there's one PhD student, which is a physical oceanographer, and he is using all our biological information, and he's combining it with physical oceanography to figure out what the effect of this one wind farm is on the environment. And then the next step, if you know, for one wind farm, the next step will be to combine multiple wind farms in that one in a single model. We are not there yet. Otherwise, this guy would probably have been presenting here. What you need to do here is coupling a lot of things. We really have to couple. We have to get the physical oceanography correct, and it has to be coupled with all this biological information that I have been presenting here. And also, gathering this biological information is time consuming, because you need PhD students, you need time. This is based on a lot of experiments. So we are getting there. We are not there yet, at least not with this approach. And there are some models that look at, for instance, phytoplankton consumption by offshore wind farms, or by the fouling fauna on offshore wind farms. And they see, as we do, is they see a local depletion in that primary in the standing stock of this phytoplankton, and then they see an increase somewhere else, because there's always a balance. If the phytoplankton is being grazed away, they don't use the nutrients, and the nutrients will be used somewhere else. And that's very important information. It's very nice information, but this is only model based. It is not really validated by measurements at sea. This is a very good starting point for research as we are doing. But what we really want to do is try to combine the real actual in situ measurements and in situ situations with yeah, the oceanography then at some stage. So one of the things we are trying to pursue as well.
Great. Okay, we're going to continue this discussion after Emma's presentation. Thank you, Jan. Just to Dave, Bethany, Emma's going to present, and then you're going to ask a clarifying question. So just to put you on the spot. So Emma, would you like to share your screen?
Thank you very much to the organisers for inviting me to speak today. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to share our research. The title of my talk today is The Ecological Interactions with Offshore Installations, the Potential Benefits of Ambitious Management. And I'm presenting today on behalf of my Exeter colleagues, University of Exeter colleagues, Anthony Bicknell and Matthew Witt, and Plymouth University colleagues, Luke Holmes, Amy Cartwright, and Martin Atwell. So I'm a senior research fellow from the University of Plymouth, and this is a place that really is a leader in marine renewable energy research with expert ecologists, oceanographers, engineers, and it's home to the world-class test facility Coast Lab, and this provides physical modelling testing with combined waves, currents and wind. My group is particularly interested, as I said before, in marine protected areas and ecosystem-based fisheries management, and also these offshore installations that have a potential to be super MPAs by potentially excluding destructive fishing practices, adding structures and habitat, as Jan was saying. So we also have research in marine renewable energy and offshore aquaculture. And we have developed and use a range of methods of deploying cost and time effective methods that are non-destructive off small fishing boats, so that we can use small boat fishing communities to do our research. And these mostly take the form of underwater cameras and also acoustic telemetry to tag and track organisms. So this term ocean sprawl is becoming more widely known as there is more pressure and applications for offshore installations to be installed in our seas. And it is so important for us to consider the benthos, the seabed and the associated fish communities, because it really is the foundation for the whole marine ecosystem. They provide nursery habitats, feeding habitats for mobile species of commercial and conservation importance. And as Jan was saying, other ecosystem services such as water filtration, sediment stabilization, carbon sequestration. So my research, as opposed to what Jan was talking about, which was offshore wind, I'm going to talk about technologies that have similarity. So wind, tidal and floating, wave, tidal and floating wind. And these all present the obvious opportunities of providing renewable energy. And they have this ability to exclude, or the capability to exclude damaging activities and create habitat. And there are challenges with this industry. There's obviously this conflict with other marine sectors, and they have these other potential issues that result, such as habitat loss, noise, EMF, and the potential of spreading non-native species. So this subject area is not new. We've been doing this a long time. However, there are still huge data gaps. And like the question Andy just asked, about scaling up, we actually still really only have, most of our environmental studies are limited to small scale individual devices or with experimental designs that aren't fit for purpose. We are, if you want to know more about this as well, there's a paper that came from our ICES group as well called Turning Off the Drip. We also suffer a lack of baseline data and an understanding of natural temporal and spatial variation of our systems. And we have this huge issue of shifting baselines. Most of our coasts were known to be actually colonized by oysters and mussel reefs. And now, a lot of them are sediment habitats, and that's necessarily their natural state. And so what we're trying to do is move away from this constant, like the consenting process. It's very negative and looking at negative impacts and of systems that are already impacted, and try and move in a more progressive way. So how can we help make offshore renewables act more like a de facto marine protected area, or how can we get them to support essential fish habitats? So the first lesson I want to bring is actually from a marine protected area that we've been studying for 13 years, since scallop dredging was excluded from this area. And it's now quite well accepted that rocky reef habitats are not compatible with bottom tow fishing because of how they affect the animals, the reef associated animals that grow in them. But what was new that we learned in this particular MPA was it wasn't just the rocky reefs that were recovering, it was also the sediment habitats between the rocky reefs. So a lot of these sediments, while on a side scan might look like sediment, they're actually more like a sediment veneer. And when they were protected from fishing, they stabilized, allowing reef associated species to colonize them. And so we've ended up with far more reef once thought there was. And I think this is particularly important for all renewables, because I think a lot of the siting of these sort of industries is on this kind of habitat, with some rocky reefs, some boulders, some sandy habitats. And for this reason, we're calling for the whole site approach. So we would like all MPAs and all offshore installations to just be managed the same. So all the habitat within that area to have consistent management that protects the seabed. And this place, it still has static gear fishing as well. So I'm talking about the most destructive bottom tow fishing. And this trend was also seen by Brian E. Pierce and colleagues in 2014, when they saw Sabellaria reef recovering between offshore wind turbines. So there's a paper just out from our team in marine policy called Emerging Themes for Ambitious Conservation Management, where these ideas, as well as some others, are highlighted. So I'm going to talk about two case studies to do with marine renewables. One is Wave Hub in the southwest UK, and one is right at the top of Scotland in Orkney. So Wave Hub is a test site for wave energy converters. The cable route for this site was deployed in 2010. So it's 10 years ago now. 18 kilometres of cable was deployed, and where it leaves the land and heads out to sea, it was buried in sort of sandy habitats, and then it goes, as it reaches the site, it went into more rocky reef habitats, and so half of the cable was buried under 80,000 tonnes of rock armouring. And I should mention this site is predominantly used by static gear fishers, so when we got there, the seabed was actually in pretty good nick. But sadly to report, no wave energy converters have actually plugged into this site yet. And so while we have got extensive surveys and baseline data over time, where we surveyed inside the Wave Hub and controls to the east and west, there's no impact to measure yet. So we have a really good baseline that someone can take advantage of, hopefully in the near future. But I'm just going to focus today on the cable route itself, as this is what has changed. So we are using two methods, the towed video and baited video. So I'm going to leave the baited video for now. This was led by University of Exeter. And just to focus on the towed video, we've developed this in my team to survey mixed habitats, so particularly when we're monitoring recovery. So this floats above the seabed, and so we're not damaging the species that we're trying to monitor their recovery over time. And it's very easy to deploy off quite small fishing boats that are, say, 10 metres long. So for this research, the cable rock armouring was deployed in 2010, and then we started monitoring 2 years after this, 4 years after, and 5 years after. So there's a total of 9 sites, and each site they've got controls to the east and west, and these data are presented in a special session in the NICE Journal of Marine Science on decommissioning. So to monitor the recovery or the colonisation of this cable route, we were looking at assemblage composition, number of taxa, abundance, different taxonomic groups, to test the hypothesis that over time, biodiversity on the cable would become enhanced relative to the controls, given that it's got this extra habitat. And the seabed in this area was coarse sediment with cobbles, boulders and rock. And the first thing we did was using eModNet seabed habitat maps, has delineated a bioregion so we could understand the scale of impact. And the cable route was 0.036 kilometres of the 914 kilometres of our bioregion. So we had some variable results. When we looked at number of taxa, so this is number of species, but with video we can't identify everything to species, so we just call it taxa. There's two graphs here. The cable route is the browny purple line, and the control to the east and west is the turquoise and green. So the total number of taxa actually never recovered over this time of monitoring the cable route and was always higher in the controls. However, the overall abundance of all the animals we recorded was variable over time, but wasn't significantly different between the cable route and the control. And to understand the difference between these two trends, it comes down to how the different species respond and colonize. So we had three different trends. The first was those sort of species that have early colonization and then remain greater on the cable route, such as the sponges. Ones that are slow to colonize and then converge over time, such as the anemones and corals. And those that are slow to colonize and then even after 5 years remained lower on the cable route. Now, of course, what would be really interesting now is to go and repeat this and see how the trends are now after another 5 years. But within these data, we saw three main patterns of recovery that highlight the importance of regular, robust monitoring to inform appropriate management and decommissioning strategies that should be considered during the consenting process. And depending on the age of the substructures, it is likely that the total removal of structures could have a greater impact than construction phases, and therefore partial decommission could be preferred. And we're kind of thinking about this a bit later in the day, but if we were going to start again, we'd say that it's therefore essential to consider the construction materials, because we might be designing these structures to be left, and therefore they need to be benign in the marine environment. So moving northwards up to the top of Scotland in Orkney, at the European Marine Energy Centre, we started a project, Clean Energy from Ocean Waves, CFOW. This started in 2017 to look at the effect of Wellow's penguin wave energy converter on seabed biodiversity. So again, we were using the towed video and baited video. And then this project seamlessly linked into our second project, which is SeaWave, Strategic Environmental Assessment of Wave Energy Technologies. And this was a specific call to address environmental impacts, and then it allowed us to advance from the single device to multi-device and multi-year effects. So this is ongoing. There will be an environmental impact review. There'll be an open access database, which is already live. And to add to the towed video and the baited video that we've already started at this site, we will also be incorporating pelagicams that allow us to look at the fish aggregation effect around the devices. And X will be doing, or are doing, I should say, SIMRAD EK60 to look at fish distributions over a wider spatial scale. And they're also passive acoustic devices in the vicinity of the WEX and at reference locations to characterize noise signature of wave energy sites and the surrounding environment. So we have had quite a few delays and issues with getting devices in the water. So I'm not going to try and present these data yet. They're not quite ready to interrogate. But last summer, we managed to achieve 7 kilometers of transect footage in water depths of 55 to 80 meters, where over 12,000 individuals have been enumerated from 83 species across 8 phyla. And the plan is now to sort of publish this time series from the first device. And we now have a baseline to measure these subsequent devices when they come. And we'll be looking at functional trends and also a study on flapper skate, that this site seems to be particularly important, and seeing whether we can use baited video images to identify individuals. So as I sort of hinted, we have had these challenges in changing technologies, altered deployment schedules, politics of affected funding. And this has been our experience in this industry, is it has been quite frustrating and it has been slow to progress, but it is progressing and expanding on past experiences working in wave energy installations. We continue to build relationships with between sectors. So as I said, these data will be made available via the Marin data database. So we're doing lots of research, but we still need devices in the water to really understand what's happening. And so I'm going to draw just briefly on some work we're doing from an offshore mussel farm that's just positioned less to the marine protected area I mentioned earlier. So this is in the southwest of the UK, and these mussel ropes are the UK's first large-scale offshore mussel farm, and they have many similarities with the floating marine renewable energy industry. Have similar moorings, and as Jan was sort of saying, they have they're sharing the similar biofouling communities on the mussel ropes, including the mussels. They also have the potential to exclude bottom toe fishing and add structure and food. So I won't go into all the details, but just to summarise, we have seen that in areas that were heavily degraded seabed, we've seen that the mussel shell fallout onto the seabed habitat seems to be increasing local biodiversity. It's restoring benthic habitats. It's also increasing the benthic commercially valuable species, such as lobster and crab on the seabed, but it's also increasing commercially valuable species in the water column as well. It's quite well known at the local fishermen now that if they're going out bass fishing, they might come to the ropes to get live scad bait before they go off to their more traditional bass grounds. So to really quantify this, we are right in the middle of a project now called Rope, which where we will tag sea bass, crab and lobster, and then use acoustic telemetry to track their movement within the farm. And then, oh, could you try again? Sorry, my watch is talking to me. And then to see how they spill over into neighbouring fishing grounds and then. So this is ongoing, and we're now kind of waiting for coronavirus to allow us to get out there and work. So if you're interested in any of this, it's all the papers are stacking up and they're ready, almost ready to go, and they'll be published soon. But there is a summary of this research in the Food Science and Technology Journal that you can access. So to echo what Jan said, we're in full support of trying to get these blue industries to co-locate. We think that there's lots of potential for environmental benefit of putting offshore aquaculture together with offshore renewables from an environmental point of view, but also from an economic point of view. Sharing space is going to be the only way I think we can move forward for this industry. And so to come back to my original title, Ecological Interactions with Offshore Installations, the Potential Benefits of Ambitious Management. My main key message is, if managed to exclude bottom toe fishing from the whole site, offshore developments can have positive effects on the ecosystem. They can increase ecosystem services, they can support other fisheries and help us move towards a carbon neutral society. But to support this management that, I know is going to be unpopular with the fishing industry, we really need long-term, large array scale monitoring of relevant ecosystem components. We need to explore the potential for shared space and co-location of offshore aquaculture with offshore agriculture. And we need to quantify and publicise the beneficial effects on ecosystem processes and services, such as spillover for fishing, recovery potential for essential fish habitats, and carbon sequestration. So with that, I'd like to acknowledge my funders, fishermen, the team, project partners and collaborators. And I'd like to thank you all very much for listening, and I look forward to hearing your points and questions on this subject. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. Dave, do you have any questions? Would you like to start the questions?
Sure, I have lots of questions. Thank you very much, Emma. I guess in terms of asking clarifying questions, can you just talk a little bit about what it takes to get data from video imagery. That seems to be the foundation of your research. And if there are kind of particular challenges using that method in these areas that we know, are high wave generation or wind areas, and that would not necessarily be the best for taking underwater photography.
Yeah, thank you. So start with your last part of your question. Collecting some of these data can be, can be an absolute nightmare, and we are so at risk from weather, because these sites are actually selected, as you say, to be high energy environments. And so this is another reason why, especially with the flying array, we've designed it so that even on board, even if we're rocking and rolling all over the place, the gear will actually be quite static. It's designed so that it's got a drop weight that comes straight down from the boat, and that helps off-roll the pitch and roll of the boat. So yeah, this is a problem, and there are obviously waves and wind where we can't go out, and so downtime is a big problem. How to fund that and how to factor that into our designs, but also there's often a lack of appreciation of how long it actually takes to analyze these data. So we come back with this video, and usually it's pretty good. We've got good at taking good quality video transect data, but to quantify this, we'll split it up. We'll analyze the whole video to count the rare and big stuff, so that we can count any big flapper skate or shy fishes that we might miss. And then we cut up all of the video into frame grabs, and then randomly select 30, which a digital quadrat is then overlaid, and the video analysts then count all the species. And it's, it's so much easier if you've got species in the hand to identify. And some of these guys have to get really expert at identifying species from video. So if we spend, say, a month on a fishing boat, it might equate to like 3 months back in the lab poring over the video and identifying it all. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you very much. I was also curious in terms of scaling this up and making it, more widespread. Have you looked into using like AI, artificial intelligence, or anything like that to help analyze what's in those frames?
Yeah, right. So I think it's got a real place, and we were using a thing called Motion Meerkat for our, when we've got the Pelagicam footage, and we have Pelagicams next to structure, and then we have it away. When it's away, we often see nothing at all, and so we can use AI to actually watch nothing for us, and it will then draw boxes around when we see things. So that's freeware, and that was developed in the US. So that's been brilliant. And I know that the AI is getting much better at identifying species, and if I was counting sea urchins or something quite specific, I would be using it. But when we're looking at changing habitats and recovering habitats, I want eyes on the video, because I want to know when something new turns up that we haven't seen before. And I know you can ground truth it, and so you're right. I think we need to probably spend more time on this, and there's certainly massive opportunities for funding this kind of research, but we haven't massively gone down this route just yet.
Julia, do you have a comment?
I have a question that kind of ties in both of their projects. So Emma, you mentioned that the farms in Europe have kind of acted as de facto marine protected areas. In the US, we're taking a very different approach, where we're actually trying to ensure that fishing will be able to continue operating in those areas. So I'm curious if the benefits of habitat creation might be negated by fishing activity, or if that's something that we don't have to be super worried about, because it sounded like the benefits occurred very close to the turbines at the most intense levels. I'm just curious if, kind of pulling it all together, what we think that's going to look like in the US context.
I think from my point of view, I just think that so little of our seabed is protected. So I'd like to see better protection for our MPAs. I mean, I know all MPAs have got all different types of management, but of the 40% of MPAs that cover 40% of our coast in the UK, it's only something like 0.01, tiny amount that actually is protected from any types of fishing. So I just see this as a massive opportunity at a worldwide scale to provide some really good protection for our seabed that can then help us start recovering these systems that are so degraded, even maybe better than MPAs, because they're more delineated and they've got structure in the sea. So I think that even though you might see the direct impact of a turbine in quite a local area, if you then just left the area around it from, you know, destructive fishing activity, it would then probably, I mean, all these habitats are different, so I'm speaking generally, but the chances are it probably will recover, and therefore the whole area could be more valuable, and then the spillover potential would be more valuable. So we're really pushing to try and manage these sites to optimize their benefits, because the sea can only take too much. Like, if we just keep adding structures, like just adding structures, that's not a good thing. But if you manage them to be, you know, as good as they can, then to me, that I can justify that more in my head.
Thank you, everyone, for adding your questions to the chat. Andy and I are monitoring that, so we'd encourage you to write your question in the chat. Everyone is sharing different resources, which is really helpful as well. Andy, I'm going to turn it to you. You've been identifying some questions from the chat, especially I know we want to respond to Fred Matera's question.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. Am I off mute?
I can hear you.
Awesome. Yeah, we have a very good question from Fred Matera. Thank you, Fred, for sharing this. And this is a question I was responding to Jan's slide. I think the slide was showing time and effects on pouting and Atlantic cod. And Fred wanted to ask, why do we hear from UK fishermen that they are finding fewer cod around wind farms and for had to relocate 20 or 30 miles away from traditional towns? There seems to be a mismatch. Question.
Jan, did you understand that? I know Andy, you keep breaking up, but it's basically, Jan, did you understand that question? Or you want me to repeat it?
No, I understood it, and I can read it in the chat as well. It's about why UK fishermen state that there are fewer cod around the wind farms, and they need to relocate their activities. Well,
yes.
Frankly, I don't know. Maybe Emma knows. She's a UK scientist. It's the first time I see this. I hear this. The only thing I can say that for us in Belgium, well, not in Belgium, but Belgium/the Netherlands. There is a movement that is fishermen that don't like the activity of offshore wind farming because there's competition for space. And the way we are putting our wind farms, it is not allowed for security reasons and safety regulations and so on to move a vessel in between the turbines. So that means lots of fishing grounds, and they need to relocate their activities. And there is this newspaper stuff popping up nowadays that says, okay, offshore wind farms are scaring the fish away. But this is really not based on anything. This is fake news. Well, we still believe it's fake news. Fake news from a group of fishermen that really managed to make it to the papers, and that at least here in Belgium, this has not really been checked. So I know this is happening in Belgium, the Netherlands. I don't know if this is something similar in the UK or whether this is actually based on real data. So I hope Emma can give you some more information there.
Yeah, I can't comment on this exact story, but what I know from a lot of experience is that whenever something new is coming, whether it be an MPA or offshore mussel farm, there is always such resistance. I mean, there's resistance if I just want to deploy a receiver on the seabed. It's the natural response of a lot of our fishing communities is to push back, and I think that's to defend areas of the sea that they've had exclusivity on for a long time, and so. But The good news is that over time, what we've shown is the advantages of these sort of places. So with the MPA, we've seen a lot of fishermen who change gear types to take advantage of the MPA and use more benign fishing methods. Or even at the mussel farm, we've started seeing fishermen that tow around the edge of the mussel farm and like will actually exchange a bag of fish with a bag of mussels with the farmers. So there's always resistance and there's always this conflict at the start, but if they're managed correctly to optimize the whole marine environment, then I think they can help build new relationships.
Andy, can you talk a little bit about the conversation about when we talk about MPAs? There's been some comments, Emma, in the chat as far as defining MPAs and specifically what you're talking about. So Andy?
Oh, great. Put me on the spot. No, we've had some, Emma, you could probably see some of the chat. There's some conversation about marine protected areas can be established for a variety of different reasons. In some marine protected areas don't eliminate commercial recreational fisheries from these areas. So it's important for us to sort of understand the definition of MPAs and how we apply them, particularly in the context of obtaining benefits or not obtaining benefits when considering MPAs within the wind farm context. I don't know if you want to add anything to those points that were made, but thank you, Paul and Malcolm, for pointing those differences out.
Yes, sorry, I should be more clear. So MPA is actually quite an unuseful term, really, because it is used to basically describe, it can be anything from a paper park that actually means nothing apart from delineating an area and someone claiming it's an area protected, to being full no take. So I'm using this term really loosely to talk generally. The MPA that I am drawing some of these stories from was the first at the UK at that scale to adopt the whole site approach. So everywhere else, all our European designated MPAs all have the feature-based approach. So the whole MPA, there's a box around it and they quote the area of that box, but the only part of that box that's actually protected is the very specific identified features. So that can be absolutely like tiny compared to the area of that MPA. And the Marine Conservation Society have actually quantified that difference. It's called the Mpa Reality Check, and it's a really great piece of work. So what we've learned by protecting the whole site is just the massive benefit to the whole area. And the more we learn about marine ecosystems, they don't just work in isolation on single features. They have different life history stages that use different habitats. And so it makes sense to just protect whole areas. And when I say protect, this site still had scallop diving, it still had potting and netting. It was just scallop dredging and trawling that was excluded. So at the moment, we're going through a highly protected marine area review, and our government's trying to understand whether we should have some sites that are actually, well, maybe no take. They're trying to understand what they look like. But yeah, I keep using this term MPA very, very broadly. But of course, here, MPAs define species and they have to be evidenced in order to be protected. But what I like about renewables is they're probably going to get consent to, because the area of the seabed isn't particularly special, but I still think it has got potential to become something and recover to something that could be really functionally important.
Julia, how is this relevant to what you're seeing and as a state regulator and reviewing some of the permits and everything? Do you have any comments or specific questions to the panelists?
So the biggest thing right now that I think we're trying to deal with is understand the effects of construction. So it sounds like there are definitely some benefits for, development of complex habitats and creating fish aggregation devices. But I'm curious if you guys can provide a little bit more information about things detected during the construction process and immediately following direct disturbance. It sounds like maybe we'll see an attraction of cod down the road, but since we in the US, or at least in southern New England, we have this huge area of contiguous wind farms that are going to be developed. So if construction is ongoing and there's lots of noise being produced, when would we expect to see some of those benefits show up? I guess I'm just trying to work through whether construction over an extended period of time could kind of delay some of the benefits that you guys have detected in projects that are a little bit more isolated from one another.
Yeah, and do you want to take this one?
Yeah, we and the Belgian part of the North Sea, so the area where I'm working is very small, and we are continuously constructing offshore wind farms for the last, I think, 10 years or even a bit more. So there's always construction going on, and the area in which this is happening is quite small. So there's some of the effects that come with constructing at one site will be felt all over the place. And so I think about piling. So we are piling. Well, not we, but I mean, in Belgium we are piling these turbines, which comes with an impulsive sound. And then what you see is what for instance, we don't have a lot of sea mammals, but we have a harbor porpoise, and they are being scared away during the piling event. But we know that we know when they are there, so they are present in our waters, and I think in two peak moments during the year. So we try to avoid piling during that moment. And there's also mitigation measures. So we have to the people that are actually piling have to work with noise mitigation measures, such as bubble curtains or even double bubble curtains, in order not to scare, in order not to harm them too much. And it's like they leave during piling, but they do come back. This is not a permanent issue. The other thing I know for sure is that there is an effect on the benthos, but this is very local. This is where we are working. The seabed needs to be prepared for putting the turbines in there to some extent, and then this is causing damage or negative effects to the animals living in that seafloor. We see drops in diversity, we see changes in communities, and so on. But this is for 2 years. This is very local. And then I think one of the studies we did that was done is we see a recovery of these communities after 2 years. And then as soon as these turbines are colonized and the erosion protection layer is colonized, well, as soon, I mean, within a couple of years, we see this increased fish abundances. There was and also lobster abundances, edible crab abundance in the area. So, and then constructing another wind farm just next to the one we are talking about, and for us next to means really like 1 kilometer away, is not having a strong effect on this increased fish abundances around a turbine or crab abundance or lobster abundance in a scour protection layer. I don't know. I hope this answers part of your question or your question.
Yes, that was helpful. Thank you.
Go ahead, Julia. Do you have a follow-up question?
Yes, just in general, I'm wondering if either of you could speak to the length of monitoring, you know, how much baseline is needed and how much post-construction monitoring is needed to actually be able to detect some of these things. We are still monitoring. We are still monitoring. We keep on monitoring. We didn't stop, at least not in Belgium, after the 3 or 4 or 5 years that are being used in other countries in Europe. And actually, I'm very happy that we do this now. Like the changes in the sediment I was speaking about. This is about now 6-7 years after the until 10 years. You see after construction. You see these changes, and you see the spatial extent. That's one thing. This has to do for us, at least
by the nature of the sediment that is there. It's very coarse sediment, so it takes a while before things will really accumulate into such an amount of accumulation that biogeochemical pathways are affected. What we also see now is that this huge diversity that is on the turbines itself is changing into a community that seems to be really a climax community, so dominated by a lower amount of species, but in higher densities. So keep on monitoring would be our advice, but you cannot monitor every wind farm. What we do in Belgium, we have an offshore gradient, which coincides with gradients in sediments and more or less 2 water masses. So we choose 3 wind farms that are regularly monitored, and we choose them as examples for a certain situation. So we focus on these situations and look at them over time, rather than going to scrape the fauna of the turbines in all the wind farms that we are having. So this is the way we're trying to do to gain maximum information over time within affordable costs, of course.
Okay, we're sorry, Jan. I know it's 10:30. We have 2 more quick questions, and then we're going to have to end. So Dave Bethany has one, and then Andy Lipsky, and then we're going to end.
I just had a question building on Julia's first question about the impacts of construction. And Jan, it seems like a lot of your work is showing that when there's a soft sediment, you kind of have this reef effect and you can have these changes. But what happens, or have you done any research when it's already complex habitat and a wind turbine is installed on that? Do we see, an eventual recovery or enhancement, or is it more negative?
The point is, with a lot of offshore wind and where they've been placed, is just heavily degraded. So it hasn't actually been much of a problem for this area of the world. I think it might start to be more of a problem as we start to move further offshore into and developing our floating wind, because there might still be some more quite sensitive coral reefs. And of course, and that's a different scenario altogether. But I don't know, for us, this hasn't been the issue due to the extent of degradation of the habitats. And I don't know your waters well, but do you think that this is going to be a problem, or is it more likely to be areas that are now needed, like can now be recovered?
So I brought it up because there's a specific question in an area that's was utilized by fishermen here and is designated essential fish habitat. Yet they're going to develop a wind farm right on top of it. So that question is really forefront for us and a concern.
Yeah, so I think that if we have got really good habitat and we have other places to develop, that's the sort of area to me that should just be protected. So I wouldn't like to see the loss of important habitats. But all these things, you have to be pragmatic, and depending on how it is then managed. It could be managed to further protect. It's all about the timescales that we're talking about. But my preference is if we have nice pristine habitats, then please leave them alone, because we've got very few of them left.
Okay, and then Andy, you have your last question.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted. There's, first of all, as Jen had mentioned, we have lots of excellent questions that we're not going to get to. And I apologize for that. I'm going to try to do a few of them at the same time. Malcolm, good to see you again on the chat, and Matt Gove and Eric Chapman. I think I could wrap your all question. Malcolm makes a really important point that these areas of the ocean serve vital services in terms of renewable energy, in terms of food. And we look at, and your research, Jan and Emma, have looked at sort of changing productivity of these areas through the biofouling and communities that are developing, and then the knock-on impacts. So the question that I have, or that Eric and Matt and others have, are we seeing, is this local production at the wind farm? Are we seeing a net change overall at the population level, or are we just seeing shifts in productivity from one place to another? And so I sort of wanted to ask that question to you, Jan, but also Emma, you might have some thoughts on that as well.
And we're really getting to the end, so sorry if you could just be very succinct.
Yeah, I saw the paper in the question in the chat, so I checked the original paper, and it actually says there is increased local production, and there is no large effect at a larger scale. This is actually what is written in the paper, but you have to be aware that this is written 5 years ago now, so when there were limited amount of wind farms present. So it is urgently needed that someone does the upscaling. And if you have all these wind farms, I showed you the map of the entire Europe. If this is happening in all these little dots, it might be very relevant. But at the moment, I really cannot answer that question, whether it has a larger effect. I hope this was short enough. Emma.
Yeah, I'll just echo what you said, Jan, and this is what we need. We need some decent scale research so that we can start understanding these questions, answering these questions.
Great. Thank you very much. And both Emma and Jan and others will be here in the US next year, we hope. And so you guys have a year to answer all those questions that people are asking, okay? And